You wore the bracelet. That means we're lifelong partners now. The alien girl panicked, HFY. A small ding echoed through the air as the door slid open, and Rylith stepped into the human's quarters. Her antennae flicked nervously. She had to admit, she wasn't entirely sure what she was doing here. "Hello?" she called out, her voice betraying the nerves she was trying to hide. She was supposed to meet with the human leader, but as usual, she had gotten lost somewhere on this strange, sprawling station. Over here, came the cheerful voice of the human, the one they called Captain Mark. He was seated in a small corner of the room, fiddling with some kind of device. Rylith approached, her talons clicking lightly on the floor with each step. Hi," Rylith said, a little unsure of what to do next. "I'm sorry, I seem to have taken a wrong turn somewhere." Captain Mark looked up at her, his lips spreading into a grin. "No problem at all, Rylith, it's a big station, come sit down." She hesitated for a moment before walking over to a chair across from him. Her eyes couldn't help but wander to the small metallic bracelet he was wearing on his wrist. It had been a symbol of an ancient Earth tradition she'd learned about only days ago, the idea that wearing such a bracelet meant something far more important than just fashion. But surely, no human would actually follow through with it. It was absurd. Mark must have noticed the direction of her gaze because he laughed softly. "Oh, this? I know you're probably wondering, but it's a big deal in human culture. Wearing the bracelet means you're officially bonded, partners for life." Rylith froze. Her mind raced. She had read about the customs of the humans, but there was one thing she didn't understand. Why was he wearing it now? Why was it in this context? She had only met Mark a few hours ago. Her pulse quickened. Wait, you're not saying, her words faltered as the realization dawned on her. "You're saying we're, what, partners? Lifelong partners?" Captain Mark looked at her, his grin widening. "Yep, you wore the bracelet. So that means we're officially bonded now. No going back. It's a human thing. Pretty serious, pretty permanent. I mean, don't worry, I'm a good partner. I've got your back." Rylith stared at him, her eyes wide. She was an alien, and she barely knew what was going on. She'd heard of human customs before, of course, but never like this. She had thought it was just some kind of joke. But here he was, so completely calm and serious. She felt a rush of panic. The bracelet had slipped onto her wrist earlier when she'd been distracted. She hadn't meant to, she didn't even know how it had happened. But now, according to human tradition, she was trapped. "Wait," Rylith said quickly, standing up and backing away a little. "I didn't mean to, I didn't intend to." Mark raised his hands, laughing. "Relax. It's a custom. We're partners now. Nothing weird about it. You know, like lifelong teammates. We'll face challenges together. We'll stick it out. That kind of thing." Rylith's antennae twitched in panic. "Lifelong?" "Yep. But what if I don't?" Mark leaned back in his chair, looking unbothered. "It's not a big deal. We'll figure it out. You're stuck with me now, whether you like it or not." Rylith's head spun. She was stuck? This was insane. The human seemed so nonchalant, almost casual about it. Didn't he realize what it meant? How could someone do this without even consulting the other party first? But then again, Rylith thought with a sigh, humans had always been unpredictable in ways that baffled her. Still, the idea of being bound to someone she barely knew was terrifying. Even if he was kind, it was overwhelming. "You're serious about this," she said slowly, still processing the idea. "Absolutely," Mark said with an easy grin. "We'll have a blast. I mean, you're one of the first aliens I've bonded with, so that's kind of a huge deal for me." Rylith's heart was still racing, but something in Mark's voice softened the sharp edge of her panic. He wasn't pushing her. It wasn't like he was asking her to marry him right then and there, was it? Maybe it wasn't as permanent as it seemed. "All right," she said carefully, sitting back down. "But what does it mean, exactly? I need to understand." Mark shrugged. "It's a symbol of trust, of partnership. For humans, it's a sign that we'll always have each other's backs, no matter what happens. It's not about ownership. It's about connection. We're allies, and I promise, I won't leave you hanging." Rylith tilted her head, her antennae drooping slightly. "I don't know if I'm ready for all that, but I guess we'll see." Captain Mark smiled warmly. That's all I'm asking. We'll take it one step at a time. And for the first time since entering the humans' quarters, Rylith felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this odd human custom wasn't as terrifying as she had thought. It wasn't so much about being stuck as it was about walking together into an uncertain future. And maybe, just maybe, she could get used to the idea of having a lifelong partner, if that partner was Mark. All right, Mark, she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Let's see where this goes. Mark gave her a nod. Deal. Partners. For life. And despite the panic that had gripped her moments earlier, Rylith couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the future wasn't so scary after all. The end. You wore the bracelet. That means we're lifelong partners now. The alien girl panicked, HFY, continued. The days following the bracelet incident were a blur for Rylith. She spent her time working with Captain Mark and the crew, trying to make sense of her new, unexpected bond. But every time she looked at the bracelet, now firmly secured around her wrist, the reality of it hit her again. She was partnered with a human, a lifelong partner. At first, it wasn't so bad. Mark was, well, he was a lot to handle, but in a way that made him kind of endearing. He was always upbeat, always optimistic, and he genuinely cared about her well-being. He made an effort to show her the ropes of human culture, even bringing her into various team activities. She had never been part of something so inclusive, and it was both overwhelming and oddly comforting. Still, the pressure of the bond weighed on her. Every time someone on the station or one of the crew members addressed her as Mark's partner, her antennae would twitch in discomfort. Did it mean what she thought it meant? Did it mean she couldn't ever leave? Could she ever leave? Rylith, over here. Mark waved his hand energetically from across the training hall. His infectious grin was visible from a mile away. As always. Rylith reluctantly shuffled over to him, doing her best to smile back. They were in the middle of a training exercise with the rest of the crew, and Mark had made it clear that Rylith was expected to participate. Even though her natural agility was nothing like the humans, he was trying to make her feel included. He even called her his official partner in crime, which she couldn't decide whether to laugh at or groan. All right, what's next? Rylith asked, her voice betraying a small amount of exasperation. Mark didn't seem to notice. He grabbed a pair of lightweight combat gloves and handed them to her. This one's easy. We're doing some hand-to-hand sparring today. Just a quick bout to get you warmed up. Rylith blinked, her antennae flicking upward in alarm. Sparring? She repeated. You want me to? Yup, just a friendly match. No pressure. You'll do great. Rylith looked at the gloves in her hands, and then back at Mark. I've never sparred before, she muttered, already regretting agreeing to join the crew. Are you sure about this? Mark just shrugged. Hey, I'll go easy on you, and if things get out of hand, I'll call it off. You're my partner now. It's my responsibility to make sure you're not hurt. Rylith blinked again. Responsibility? Yep, Mark grinned wider. We're in this together. That's what partners do. Take care of each other. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. There was that word again, partner. She still wasn't entirely sure what it meant, but she felt it now more than ever. She couldn't run from it. Mark's bright smile, his genuine enthusiasm, and his protective streak, it all made her hesitate before she could even think about backing out. All right, fine, Rylith said, reluctantly sliding the gloves on. But you are going easy on me, right? Mark winked. Of course, you ready? Rylith squared her shoulders. Let's do this. The match was surprisingly fun. Rylith had never experienced anything like it. Mark was fast, but he kept the moves light and playful, making sure to hold back enough so she didn't feel overwhelmed. It wasn't the same as her combat training back home, but it felt like a bonding experience, something that, despite her nerves, started to feel good. After a few minutes, Rylith found herself laughing, a sound that felt foreign to her in this strange new world she was navigating. She'd always been a little more serious, especially back on her home planet. But with Mark, things seemed different, easier, somehow. When the sparring session finally ended, Mark grinned, taking off his gloves and holding his hand out to her. See? I told you it wasn't so bad. Rylith shook his hand, still trying to process the odd combination of feelings swirling inside her. There was a warmth in her chest, something that felt like trust, a feeling she hadn't been sure she'd ever experience again, especially with humans. "Yeah," she said, smiling back. "I guess you were right." The rest of the crew applauded their match, and Rylith's eyes widened slightly when she noticed how many people had gathered to watch. It was just a sparring session, why were they making such a big deal out of it? But then, one of the crew members called out, "Look at that, the new partner's got some serious moves." Mark's grin didn't falter as he turned to her, his expression fond. "Told ya, my partner's the best." And suddenly, Rylith realized something. It wasn't about being bound by the bracelet. It wasn't about being stuck or forced into something she didn't understand. It was about choice. She chose to keep moving forward. She chose to trust this human, this strange, chaotic being who seemed to genuinely care. Maybe, just maybe, this whole lifelong partner thing wasn't so terrifying after all. Later that evening, as they sat on the deck overlooking the stars, Rylith found herself asking a question she hadn't thought to voice before. "Mark," she began, her voice quieter than usual, what if we change? What if we grow apart?" Mark looked up at the stars, his expression thoughtful for a moment before he responded. "That's part of it too, Rylith, growing, changing. But as long as we stick together, through all the changes, that's what matters. We're partners, for better or worse." Rylith's heart gave a little lurch. "For better or worse?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, and that's the human way. We don't give up, no matter what." Rylith felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time since the bracelet had slipped onto her wrist, she didn't feel trapped. She didn't feel like a prisoner of some human custom. She felt understood. "All right," she said, her voice soft. "I think I'm starting to understand." Mark turned toward her, that familiar grin back in place. "Well, welcome to the club, partner." And for the first time, Rylith truly smiled. Maybe this lifelong partnership wouldn't be so bad after all. The end, for now. "You wore the bracelet. That means we're lifelong partners now," the alien girl panicked, HFY, continued. A few weeks had passed since Rylith had reluctantly accepted her lifelong partnership with Mark. The awkwardness had mostly faded, and they had settled into a new rhythm together. Still, every time someone mentioned it, partnership, Rylith couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was missing. What did it all mean for her? Really? Was she just going to stay here, with humans, forever? Mark had a way of making everything seem simple, even when it wasn't. He was always there to help. Always upbeat, always smiling. Yet, Rylith still found herself struggling to let go of the doubt. Sure, she was starting to trust him, but what if the bond was more than just a casual thing to him? One morning, while they were preparing for another mission, this time involving a delicate negotiation with an alien species, Rylith found herself pacing in her quarters. The mission was critical. It could determine the future of the interspecies relations in this part of the galaxy. And if it failed, well, Rylith wasn't sure what would happen, but she knew it wouldn't be good. Mark was supposed to be meeting her soon, but he hadn't arrived yet. The clock ticked by, and her nerves kept building. She paced faster, her tail flicking behind her. Finally, the door slid open with a soft chime, and Mark stepped inside, looking uncharacteristically serious. His usual grin was gone, replaced by a more focused expression. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady. Rylith stopped pacing and turned to face him. "You're late," she said, but her voice lacked its usual edge. It was more of a nervous question than an accusation. Mark didn't seem to notice. He nodded and stepped further into the room. "Yeah, sorry about that. We got some last-minute intel, but you're gonna be great on this mission. You've got the skills, you've got the knowledge, and hey, you've got me, your partner, so nothing's going to go wrong." Rylith raised an eyebrow, still trying to process the word partner. Mark was always confident, always reassuring, but this time it felt more real. She couldn't just smile it away anymore. This was her life now, wasn't it? "You keep saying that," she muttered, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for this, being your partner. I mean, I barely know anything about you, Mark, about humans, about what this us really means." Mark paused. the lightness in his eyes dimming slightly. I get it. Rylith, trust me. I do. It's a lot. I mean, we don't even know everything about us either. But that's the thing, we'll figure it out. We'll learn from each other. I might not have all the answers, but I've got you, and that's what matters. Rylith looked away for a moment, her eyes scanning the station's viewports. She could see the swirling nebulae in the distance, stars flickering like distant dreams. It was a beautiful sight, but it also made her feel small. The vastness of the universe, the weight of her place in it. I just don't know, Rylith confessed softly. I don't know if I'm ready to be this. Tied down. I didn't come here expecting a lifelong commitment. I came here because I wanted to learn, to explore, not to be anchored. Mark's expression softened. He walked over to her, standing beside her near the viewport. Hey, I hear you. This is a lot. But what if it's not about being tied down? What if it's about having someone to face it all with? What if it's not about being stuck, but about choosing to go through this crazy universe together, no matter where it takes us? She glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She expected him to shrug it off, make another joke, but instead, he was calm, earnestly there. I don't know, Mark, she whispered. I just don't know what comes next. I've never been someone's partner. I've never been this connected to anyone. What if I don't fit into this? Mark smiled, and this time, there was no playful teasing behind it. It was just a simple, honest smile. That's the thing, Rylith. We don't have to fit perfectly. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real. You don't have to have all the answers, and neither do I. But as long as we're in this together, we'll make it work. We'll figure it out. Partners, right? Rylith swallowed, her chest tightening with an unfamiliar sensation. Maybe it wasn't about being stuck after all. Maybe it wasn't about the ancient human customs or the bracelet or the promise of forever. Maybe it was about learning to be something different, together. She turned to him, meeting his gaze with more certainty than she had felt since their first meeting. All right, partners. Mark's grin returned, though it was gentler this time. He gave her a slight nod. That's the spirit. Now, how about we go show these aliens what humans, and our partners, can do? Rylith smirked. You're getting pretty good at this partner thing, Mark. You're a fast learner, he teased, his eyes sparkling. Now, let's make this mission a success, together. The mission went off without a hitch. Rylith had to admit, Mark was right. There was something about having a partner by your side that made everything a little easier. They worked seamlessly as a team, negotiating with the alien species and securing the deal for the Federation. No hiccups, no failures, just two people, two partners, working together to face the unknown. When they returned to the station, the crew celebrated their success. But for Rylith, the real victory wasn't the mission, it was the realization that she wasn't alone in this galaxy. Not anymore. Mark had kept his promise. He'd had her back. He wasn't just a human with a silly custom. He was someone who understood what it meant to be there for each other, to face the challenges, the uncertainties, together. As they stood side by side, watching the celebration unfold, Rylith looked down at the bracelet on her wrist. It was a symbol of a promise, yes, but it was also a choice she had made. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The end, for now. You wore the bracelet. That means we're lifelong partners now. The alien girl panicked, HFY, continued. Weeks turned into months, and the bond between Rylith and Mark only grew stronger. They faced mission after mission together, often side by side, learning from each other in ways they hadn't anticipated. But despite the growing closeness, there were still moments when Rylith found herself on edge. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to having someone so deeply invested in her, in them. She still remembered the day Mark had first worn the bracelet, how he had casually told her that they were bonded for life. To Rylith, it had seemed so permanent, so overwhelming. But now, with every passing day, that permanence didn't feel like a weight, it felt more like a foundation. Yet, even with that understanding, a part of her still couldn't quite shake the feeling that she wasn't truly ready for everything this relationship might eventually demand. One day, as the ship drifted through the outskirts of a newly discovered star system, Rylith found herself once again pacing in the quiet solitude of her quarters. The soft hum of the ship's engines was the only sound that filled the room. She hadn't been able to focus on anything for hours, her mind spinning in circles. She didn't know why it bothered her now, but the thought of the future had become heavier than ever. What would happen once they finished their missions here? What if Mark's idea of forever didn't match hers? She had never stayed in one place for too long before, never been tied to anyone for this long. What if one day she needed to leave? The bracelet, her symbol of commitment to Mark, was still there on her wrist, and the weight of it felt different now. She stared at it, her mind tangled in knots. Rylith? The voice that broke her thoughts was Mark's. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make her look up. He was standing in the doorway, his expression soft, but something in his eyes told her that he had been watching her for a while. Rylith didn't even realize she'd been holding her breath until she exhaled sharply. "I'm fine," she lied quickly, turning her gaze back toward the stars beyond the viewport. "Just thinking." Mark stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with a familiar sense of comfort. I know that look. You've got that Rylith's deep in thought thing going on." "I don't have a thing," Rylith shot back, trying to keep the tension out of her voice. "You absolutely do," Mark said, moving closer. He stopped just a few feet away from her, studying her carefully. "What's going on? You've been on edge for a few days now. Something on your mind?" Rylith hesitated. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell him everything was fine, but the truth was, she wasn't sure what fine meant anymore. There was so much she didn't know, about herself, about the future, about them. She began, her voice softer than usual. She stared at the bracelet again, and her chest tightened. "I don't know, Mark. I'm still getting used to all this. The mission, the crew, and us. I thought I understood it at first. I thought I knew what I was getting into. But now, I don't know what to think anymore." Mark's eyes softened with understanding. He stepped closer, carefully, as if giving her space to decide whether she wanted to share more. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Rylith. You're allowed to have doubts. You don't need to have everything sorted, or even know what tomorrow's going to bring. Hell, we don't even know where we'll be next week, but we do know that we've got each other. And that's something. That's a start." Rylith felt a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth, despite the weight of the emotions that swirled inside her. His words, as simple as they were, always seemed to pull her back from the edge. "But this," she motioned toward the bracelet. "What does it mean? What if I can't? I don't know. Keep up with it? With the commitment? What if I'm just not cut out for this?" Mark stood still, contemplating her words. Then, in a surprising gesture, he placed his hand over hers, gently resting on top of the bracelet. His touch was warm, grounding. "Rylith, you don't need to worry about being perfect. You're already a lot more than I ever expected from this whole partner thing. You make me a better person just by being here. Just by being you. It's not about keeping up. It's about being together through everything, whatever happens." She blinked, her heart racing. "But what if we grow apart? What if—" "Hey," Mark interrupted softly, his fingers gently squeezing her hand. "We're not perfect. We don't have to be. But we're not going to stop trying. And that's what makes it real. Rylith, you don't have to have all the answers. I sure don't. But as long as we're honest with each other, we'll be all right." The words hit Rylith like a wave, washing over the doubts she hadn't even realized she'd been holding on to. She'd never been good at being vulnerable, at opening up, but something in Mark's steady gaze, his unwavering belief in their partnership, made her feel like maybe she could be. "All right," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I can do that. Be honest. Try." Mark's face lit up with that grin of his. "That's all I'm asking for." A weight seemed to lift from Rylith's chest as the tension melted away. She had been so focused on what might go wrong that she hadn't considered what was already going right. They were partners, and that didn't mean they had to have everything figured out. It meant they'd be there for each other no matter what, through all the uncertainty, all the mistakes, and all the unknowns. Later that evening, after they finished preparing for their next mission, Mark looked at her with a glint of mischief in his eyes. "You know, there's a whole galaxy out there. I'm kind of looking forward to exploring it with you. No pressure, but I'm kind of hoping we'll get lost a few times, just to see what happens." Rylith laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're impossible." "But I'm your impossible," he replied with a wink. And for the first time in a long time, Rylith didn't feel afraid of what came next, because whatever happened, they would figure it out together. The end, for now. You wore the bracelet. That means we're lifelong partners now. The alien girl panicked, HFY, continued. The mission was simple enough, escort a diplomat to a neutral planet for peace talks. But as Mark and Rylith suited up for the mission, she could sense a shift in the air. This wasn't just another routine task. There was an undercurrent of tension, something unspoken, as though the crew knew that something big was at stake. Mark caught her eye as they prepared to board the shuttle. You all right? He asked, his voice a mixture of concern and quiet reassurance. His hand hovered near the bracelet on her wrist, and he seemed to be offering her that same unspoken promise that had become their shared language. Rylith nodded, though her nerves fluttered in the pit of her stomach. Yeah, I'm good, just feeling a little off today. You're not the only one, Mark said with a wry grin. This peace deal has more politics behind it than a Krivashan court dance. Rylith raised an eyebrow. What's a Krivashan court dance? Mark grinned even wider. It's complicated. Trust me, you don't want to know. They both laughed, but it didn't quite mask the tension that seemed to surround them. The shuttle ride to the neutral planet was quiet. The low hum of the engines, the only sound that filled the cabin. Rylith stared out the window at the distant, swirling colors of the nebula they passed through, her thoughts still restless. When they arrived on the planet, the atmosphere only heightened her unease. It was a place of both beauty and danger, lush forests that stretched as far as the eye could see, interspersed with ancient stone ruins that spoke of an older, almost forgotten civilization. The neutral parties had chosen this place as a symbol of peace, but the weight of history hung in the air like a storm cloud. As they disembarked, Rylith could sense the wariness in Mark's posture, though he was trying his best to hide it behind his usual bravado. He glanced over at her, catching her eye. This isn't going to be simple, is it? She asked, knowing he would understand what she meant. Mark sighed, his usual lightheartedness slipping for a moment. Not really, but it's important, and we'll do what we've always done, face it together. Rylith nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her at his words. This was what she had signed up for, partnership, even when things were uncertain, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. The negotiations were tense from the start. The planet's representatives, an ancient species known as the Varants, were known for their strict codes of conduct and deep distrust of outsiders. The talks had barely begun when the Varanth diplomat made it clear that they weren't particularly interested in compromise. Mark did his best to play the mediator, his diplomatic skills sharp, but Rylith could tell that the situation was about to take a turn. The room, once filled with the polite murmur of discussions, had shifted into an icy silence. Rylith's antennae twitched nervously, and she couldn't help but glance at Mark. He caught her look, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he spoke up, trying to keep the conversation flowing, but the tension was thick, and it wasn't long before things broke down. We can't give you any more than what's already been offered, the Varanth diplomat said, his tone cold. Your federation has no standing here. Rylith stepped forward, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline in her veins. Perhaps the issue isn't what's being offered, but how it's being communicated, she suggested. Trust isn't built on demands, it's built on understanding. The Varanth's sharp eyes turned to her, narrowing in suspicion. And what do you know of trust, alien? The insult stung, but Rylith held her ground. She wasn't going to let this go down without a fight, not when so many were depending on them. More than you think, she responded coolly. We're not just here to take what's ours, we're here to help, but we can only help if we understand one another. The room fell silent. For a moment, Rylith wondered if she'd just made things worse. She looked at Mark for reassurance, but he was already stepping in, his voice calm but firm. Rylith is right, Mark said, his tone cutting through the tension. This isn't about us versus you. It's about finding a way forward together. We're partners in this, and we're not backing down. Rylith's heart swelled at his words. Partners, he had said, and he wasn't just talking about the mission, he meant it. The Varanth diplomat stared at them both, his eyes unreadable. There was a long pause before he spoke again, this time with a little more uncertainty in his voice. Perhaps, we can find a way to move forward, But understand this, trust must be earned. And that will take time. Mark's smile was small but determined. We'll earn it. Together. The negotiations dragged on for hours. But by the end of the day, they had made significant progress. The Varants had agreed to continue talks, though they weren't ready to sign anything just yet. It wasn't a win, but it was a step in the right direction. And for the first time in a long while, Rylith felt something more than just relief. She felt a sense of pride. When they finally left the chamber, the weight of the day lifted off their shoulders, and they walked in silence back to the shuttle. It wasn't until they were halfway to the ship that Mark spoke up again, his voice soft. "You did good back there. You stood your ground." Rylith smiled, feeling a warm glow spread through her chest. "We did good. Together." Mark chuckled. "Yeah, together." They boarded the shuttle in comfortable silence, the stars outside the viewport brighter than they had seemed when they first arrived. Rylith glanced at the bracelet on her wrist. Still there, still a reminder of their bond, but it no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a promise, one that was still unfolding. And maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to understand each other better than either of them could have imagined. The end, for now. "You wore the bracelet. That means we're lifelong partners now," the alien girl panicked, HFY, continued. The days after the Varanth peace talks were marked by an odd quiet. Rylith had always been used to the hum of the ship, the constant bustle of the crew, and the steady stream of missions and negotiations. But something had shifted after their success. It was as if the universe had taken a breath, and everyone on the ship was waiting for something to happen, something big. Rylith felt it, too, a weightless tension in the air, something unspoken but present, like the calm before a storm. As much as Mark seemed to carry the easy confidence of a man who was always ready to tackle the next challenge, even he was quieter these days, as if lost in thought more often than not. She caught him staring out the viewport one evening, his back turned to the rest of the crew, the weight of the stars reflected in his eyes. "Mark," she called softly, approaching him. He turned, his expression softening as he recognized her. "Hey, Rylith, didn't see you there. What's up?" She glanced out the window, following his gaze, her antennae twitching slightly. "You've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" Mark gave a half-smile. "Just thinking. A lot of things happening lately, big things. I guess I'm just taking it all in." Rylith stepped closer, her heart suddenly beating faster. She had come to care for Mark in a way she hadn't fully expected. The bracelet still sat heavily on her wrist, but it felt more like a symbol now, a symbol of everything they had already shared and everything they might face in the future. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," she said quietly, her voice laced with something that surprised even her. "Whatever's on your mind, we can face it together." Mark studied her for a long moment, as though weighing something in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You're right. You've been there for me through all of this. And I guess I don't say it enough, but I appreciate it more than you know." Rylith was about to respond when the ship's communication system buzzed, cutting their conversation short. A voice crackled over the intercom, urgent and sharp. "Captain Mark, we've just picked up a distress signal. It's coming from a nearby system, a small colony. They're requesting immediate assistance. They've been attacked. It doesn't look good." Rylith's instincts kicked in. The weight of the mission hit her all at once, her mind snapping into focus. "Mark, what are we waiting for?" she asked, already moving toward the command center. Mark didn't hesitate. "Right, get the crew ready. We're going in. No one gets left behind." As they gathered the crew and prepared for departure, Rylith couldn't shake the feeling that this mission wasn't just another routine rescue. The distress signal had been too sudden, too vague. She wasn't just worried about the colony. She was worried about Mark, too. Something about his quiet demeanor earlier hadn't sat right with her. He was hiding something, and she knew it. They arrived in the system within the hour. The colony was small, nestled on a planet near the edge of a dying star. As they entered orbit, the sight was horrifying. The colony's once pristine surface was now scarred with the marks of battle, smoke rising from shattered buildings, fires still burning in several areas. The distress signal was still active, but the message it carried was fragmented. As Rylith and Mark led the team down to the surface, she couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that something more was at play here. The moment they landed, it became clear that the colony was in far worse shape than they had anticipated. The survivors were scattered and disorganized, many of them in shock, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. Mark gave orders to the crew, directing them to help the survivors and secure the area. But Rylith could see the tension in his movements. His jaw clenched in a way that made her uneasy. She knew him well enough by now to recognize when something was wrong. She found him a few minutes later, crouched next to one of the colony's leaders, a woman whose face was etched with pain. They were speaking in low tones, but Mark's expression was one of frustration, something darker flickering beneath his usual calm. "Mark," Rylith called softly, stepping up beside him. "What's going on? You're not telling me everything." He didn't look up at first, but she could see the hesitation in his shoulders as he straightened. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a trap, Rylith. This whole thing, it's not just an attack. It's coordinated. Whoever did this, they knew we'd come. They were counting on it." Rylith's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the distress signal wasn't sent out by the colony," he replied, his voice low, tight with tension. "It's a setup, and now we're in the middle of it." Before Rylith could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. A small group of armed figures appeared on the horizon, their figures outlined against the burning wreckage. They were too organized, too confident for a random band of marauders. The realization hit Rylith like a punch to the gut. "They're waiting for us." Mark nodded grimly. "And I didn't bring enough backup. We need to move fast. Get the survivors to the shuttle, now." Without another word, they sprang into action. Rylith was already scanning the area, assessing the threat, when she felt Mark's hand on her arm, pulling her back to him. "Rylith, listen to me. Whatever happens next, we stick together, you and me. Don't get separated. Promise me." The gravity of his words hung in the air, a silent vow that neither of them could ignore. The bracelet on Rylith's wrist seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as if responding to the promise they had made. She met his gaze, her chest tightening with the intensity of the moment. "I promise," she said, her voice unwavering. And together, they ran. The fight was brutal and swift. Mark and Rylith worked seamlessly, their partnership now something forged in battle as much as it had been in every quiet moment they had shared. Mark's leadership was sharp, tactical, and precise, while Rylith's agility and combat prowess proved invaluable in navigating the chaotic battlefield. When the dust settled and the last of the attackers had been repelled, they stood in the center of the wreckage, catching their breath. The survivors had been evacuated to the shuttle, and the immediate threat was neutralized. But the cost was high. The colony had been all but destroyed, and many had not made it out in time. Mark was silent as he surveyed the destruction. His face was hard, his eyes distant. Rylith stood beside him, sensing the weight of his thoughts. "You did everything you could, Mark," she said softly, her hand gently resting on his arm. He didn't look at her. "I didn't do enough," he murmured. "I should have known. I should have." Rylith didn't need to hear the rest. She knew the guilt he carried. She had seen it in his eyes ever since they had boarded the shuttle for this mission. But in that moment, Rylith understood something. He was only human, and humans, as much as they hurt, they also kept fighting. They didn't stop. "I'm here," she said quietly, the weight of her own promise clear in her heart. "I'm right here with you." Mark finally turned to her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find a way to anchor himself. After a moment, he nodded. "Together." And as they stood there, amidst the devastation, Rylith realized that, for the first time, she didn't just understand their bond, she felt it. Deep in her bones, they were bound by more than just the bracelet on her wrist. They were bound by the choices they made, the lives they fought for, and the partnership they had built from the ground up. And no matter what the universe threw at them next, they would face it together. The end, for now.